Hello, fellow Princeps! In today's post, we're going to be taking a look at Legio Ignatum, or the Fire Wasps for Titanicus, and how they play out on the tabletop. Disclaimer in advance, this is a pretty powerful Legion. They've got a great set of universal rules that can just be adapted to your playstyle, whether it's offensive or defensive, and frankly, your Titan choices. Some players prefer Warhounds over Warlords, or vice versa. In either case, their rules, in particular their Legio trait, is easily adapted regardless of Titan chassis. That being said, let's take a look at the rules. Our first and only Legio trait is called We Loyal Few. This allows your Titans to reroll hit rolls of 1 for targets that are within 12 inches of them during the combat phase. When I talked about how dangerous Ignatum can be, this is why. Whether you're an offensive or defensive player, you're going to see a benefit of this and you're going to start re-rolling those ones. If you're offensive, you're probably pushing to get as close to your opponent as you can, and the closer you get, the more you're re-rolling those ones on your arm weapons and melee weapons. If you're defensive, your opponent's giving you reroll ones. The closer they get to accomplish how their list is built, the more rerolls you're going to get. Plus, don't forget about your Warlords Ardax defense arrays. They're going to be benefiting from those reroll ones against things like Warhounds and Knights harassing them. Where this kind of gets limited is because it's combat phase, you're not going to see a use out of this trait for Titans on first fire and charge orders, something to bear in mind. And for your larger Titans, you're kind of going to have a hard time maximizing this with your carapace weapons, just due to that scale blind spot built into carapace. The Titan that kind of benefits the most from this rule is actually your humble Warhounds. They're typically operating danger close to 24 inches anyways, just because of their weapon profiles. So they're going to be spending a large part of the game at about that 12-inch distance anyways, and this gets really dangerous with squadrons and coordinated strikes. So definitely don't shy away from using Warhounds with this one either, but it's going to be really good for your Warlords and Reavers as well. That being said though, it kind of skews your weapon choices. You're going to kind of want to avoid those blast weapons just because they tend to be low shot and high strength. Obviously, the more die you're rolling, the more that reroll ones is going to come up. So I would think of looking at things like maybe Gatling blasters and say Sun Fury annihilators as opposed to volcano cannons, meltas, and quake cannons. Regardless of your playstyle, regardless of your maniple choice, this is such an adaptable rule that you can easily tweak it to your playstyle and just kind of figure out whether you're pushing against your opponent or holding it in your back pocket for when they push on you. It is just overall deadly. Our first Legio-specific stratagem is called Punish Their Folly, and this one clocks in at 1 stratagem point. When you're charged by an enemy Titan and they end within 3 inches of you, you can actually attack them with one of your ranged weapons using your ballistic skill as they're running in and before they get to attack you. This is basically Warhammer 40k Overwatch, but in Titanicus. And as awesome as it sounds, there's actually a lot to unpack here. First off, the rule specifies enemy Titan, so if you get charged by Knights, then you won't be able to use this. You get a nice workaround here using your ballistic skill when you should be using your weapon skill, meaning your Titan is accurately shooting at your opponent as they come in. Because it applies to an enemy Titan within 3 inches, You're also ignoring your opponent's void shields if they have any, which is another great workaround. And again, it's an Ignatum trend, but something like this skews your weapon choices. You're not going to want to use this on a template weapon or blast weapon, because why shoot your own Titan's feet off in the hopes of hitting your opponent as they rush in? Again, you're going to want to use that Sun Fury or Gatling for something like this. Big drawback, it's situational. If you're a defensive player, I can see you using this a lot more than if you are planning on playing Ignatum aggressively, but for one stratagem point, it's probably got play in both play styles, and it's got a place in most Ignatum lists. Our next Legio-specific stratagem is called Guard the Gates, and this one costs 2 stratagem points. What it does is, during the first game turn, you would play this in the strategy phase, and it allows you to issue first fire orders to all of your Titans without the need of doing a command check. This one's a little weird for Ignatum, in the sense that if you're bringing Reavers and Warlords, they don't really need the help with the command checks. And if you're bringing Warhounds, they're probably going to be out of range for a first fire anyways. So, off the top, this one seems very list dependent. If you've got a good way of using it, then by all means fire it in the comments below. Another thing I find with it is it's kind of a contradiction to the Legio trait, We Loyal Few. You're going to want to get within 12 inches of your opponent to get those reroll ones. So if you're issuing your Titans a first fire order on turn 1, then they're not moving, meaning you're not closing to that 12-inch gap. So this one kind of hurts your ability to use We Loyal Few. But if you are playing a super defensive army and you're expecting your opponent to alpha strike, maybe that would be a point in time I'd look at using this. But again, 2 stratagem points for something that your Reavers and Warlords don't need help getting off, it seems way too expensive for what it does. Legio Ignatum actually comes with a piece of war gear, and it's a pretty handy piece of kit. They are gravitonic sensor arrays, and for 15 points, you can apply a +1 modifier to your hit rolls when attacking an obscured Titan, so a Titan in cover. If your target is 25 to 49% in cover, where you would normally suffer a -1 to your hit rolls, you're actually gonna completely ignore that and attack at your normal ballistic skill. If that target is 50% to, I guess, 99% in cover, where you would normally be suffering a -2 to your hit rolls, you're actually only going to be suffering a -1. So this is universally handy to every list and every build. You're not going to want to put this on everything. For instance, I don't think it'd be absolutely necessary for, say, a Brawler, Warlord, or Reaver, because they're going to be closing that gap. It might be handy if you have the points for when you're moving into that midfield, but I don't think it's totally necessary. Where it could be very handy, though, is when you're using backline or long-range static Warlords to just pick off targets all the way across the table. Or your Warhounds. Warhounds tend to kind of be stalking the angles and jumping out from cover, which if you have cover, that means your opponent probably has cover. So I would say best use for this would be Warhounds, and backline support Titans could probably make the best use out of this. But if you have the points to spare and nowhere else to put them, then I would consider this on all of your Titans. I mean, it's a great upgrade. That was a look at the Legion rules, but let's see what our Maniple commanders can pull off. Our first Princeps trait is called Death Before Dishonor. After your Princeps Titan suffers critical damage, they gain the ability to reroll all hit rolls. The downside of this is, Every damage control phase, you have to allocate dice to repairing a disabled weapon before you can repair any other system. I've seen some negative reviews of this one, but this one's actually my favorite out of the three. Let's talk about the negatives here. 1, you have to have taken critical damage to activate it, so you're gonna have to get beat up. 2, you have to repair that weapon before anything else. If you come up against a pretty canny and smart opponent, all they have to do to mess with your ability to repair is just keep targeting your weapons so you can't do things like cooling your reactor or repairing your shields. On the plus side, Ignatum, you're probably going to be playing aggressively to get that 12-inch range to activate We Loyal Few, so you're going to be attracting a lot of guns anyways and getting damaged. Chances are pretty good that critical damage is going to happen, and if you're putting it on something heavy like a Warlord Titan, I would almost let my opponent critically damage me once and ignore repairing that damage just so I can get the rerolls, and not look at repairing critical damage until, say, I've got 2 or 3. Again, the Warlord has great repair dice and it can take a hit. I'd say the Warlord Titan is your best bet for Death Before Dishonor. Despite the kind of negative reviews of it, I highly rate it and would definitely look at putting this into a list. Our next trait is called Foe Slayer. This one occurs in the combat phase, and it allows you to choose one of your Princeps weapons, and that weapon adds +1 to its armor rolls. If your opponent happens to be playing Legio Mortis or Tempestus, you actually get to choose 2 of your Princeps weapons, and they both add +1 to their armor rolls. So, a few things to note with this one is it only occurs in the combat phase, meaning this isn't going to be a factor for your first fires. Bit of a handicap there. The other thing is it's kind of situational. To get the most out of this, your opponent has to be playing Mortis or Tempestus, which is kind of another drawback. Don't get me wrong, adding 1 to armor rolls is always handy, especially on a kind of mid-strength weapon and a high-strength weapon. Where this one kind of also hurts your list building is it's kind of going to skew your weapon choice because it's affecting armor rolls. So your Signoris is either going to need to be able to drop shields on a target or have a support Titan that's designed to drop shields. If you're looking at a standalone Princeps, that's probably going to mean you're going to want to look at adding missile launchers or Gatling blasters to drop the shields, and then follow up with something high strength like plasma gun of some sort, volcano cannons, or quake cannons. That being said, because it's really dependent on your opponent's shields being dropped, it's probably going to be more of a factor or a Princeps trait you use mid to late game. And to get the most out of it, it's situational depending on your opponent. So it's not bad. It could be a big factor in games depending on your opponent, but I just find it's very situational in the fact that it skews your weapon choices, and it's kind of a partial bonus compared to the full extent you would get going against Mortis or Tempestus. Our last trait is called Eternal Guardian, and this one's for all you defensive Ignatum players. How it works is once per combat phase, your Princeps can reroll a single armor roll resulting from the hits of any of their guns. To do this though, they have to have remained static and not moved voluntary or involuntary in the same round. So I say defensive in the sense that if you want to get the most out of this, you're kind of going to end up building a static gun line and have your heavy weapons in your deployment zone not moving so they can get that reroll. It's kind of an opposite to Foe Slayer in it lets you reroll essentially a failed armor roll, where Foe Slayer increases your chances of a stronger effect. So you're gonna have to leverage and pick and choose which of those two you want the most out of. And like Foe Slayer, once again, this is only affecting the combat phase, so this isn't going to be a factor for your first fire orders. Something to bear in mind. Personally, I rather lean to Foe Slayer. I just think it's more generically effective, since this is hit dependent and the other one is armor roll dependent. I feel like that +1 to armor would have more of an effect than a reroll on a failed armor roll, if that makes sense. But where this could be good is on a high strength, low shot weapon, something like a volcano cannon or a melta cannon. So you get your hit, that's great. You're rolling your armor rolls. If you whiff your armor rolls, you get to re-roll one of those 1 or one of those 2. This will help make your heavy guns more effective at dealing damage, and could be an asset in a defensive build. Now that we know what Ignatum is all about, let's take a look at my concept list and how I would hypothetically use the Legion's rules on the tabletop. This list, as per usual, is based on the match play rules for a 1750 point game with the standard random mission draw and stratagem points. As we know, a good list always starts with a mana pool. And for the Fire Wasps, I've decided to go with the Fortis mana pool. Though I have to admit, this was a very tough call not to go with the Ferox. I really could have gone either way, but ultimately I committed to the Fortis. A Fortis battle mana pool has a mandatory component of 1 Warlord and 2 Reavers, plus an optional component of another Warlord and another Reaver. If you're not familiar with a Fortis, its trait is called Titanic Fortress, and this really gives you 2 main benefits. The first one's kind of like an armored phalanx. If your Titans remain stationary in the movement phase and are in base-to-base contact, then you get to ignore any bonuses your opponent would get for attacking a structurally compromised location. Plus, you get to ignore the modifiers your opponent would get for attacking you in your side and rear arcs. The other huge bonus to this mana pool is you can merge Void Shields as if your Titans were a squadron, which just helps keep these heavier battle Titans even more durable and able to shrug off some pretty huge hits. Working off the Fortis, let's throw some numbers and weapons on these Titans. Starting with the mandatory component, my Warlord will have a Sun Fury Plasma, Gatling, and paired laser blasters up top. Got 1 Reaver with a laser blaster, Gatling blaster, and a turbo laser up top. The other Reaver will have a laser blaster, chain fist, and turbo laser up top. This mana pool's really designed to push to the midfield to take advantage of that Ignatum trait, We Loyal Few. So the weapon loadouts are designed to get the most out of that 0 to 24 inch range and throw some meaningful shots down as they advance on the opponent. Like, I'm planning on being aggressive and getting in your face. I decided not to go with missiles because we're really looking at closing in with the opponent, and I've got the laser blasters, or turbo lasers, across the board, which I can shield bane if I have to drop your shields. Plus, once I start damaging the opponent, these decent strength weapons will let me put some pretty good called shots on the opponent where I need them. The mandatory component of the list still left me with a lot of room to work with, so I added another Warlord type. This one's going to have a Plasma Sun Fury, a Power Claw, and a Laser Blaster. Now, working off the Fortis trait Titanic Fortress, even though these aren't squadrons, I'm pretty much going to be playing this mana pool as if it was 2 squadrons of 2. So the Reavers will be advancing up the board in base-to-base contact so they can merge their shields, and the Warlords will be following behind them doing the exact same thing. If one of these squadrons, so to speak, loses their shields, well, at least I still have that armored phalanx working for me, as everything's in base-to-base contact. And the warlords working together, plus the reavers working together, this is kind of keeping my movement in synergy. The warlord with the power claw and the reaver with the chain fist really have those weapon loadouts in case my opponent tries to get in my face. At least each of these squadrons, so to speak, will have the ability to slap the opponent around and not have to rely on smash attacks. The mana pool as it stands actually comes out to 1640 for the points, so I still have a lot of points to work with. I would have loved to fit in a group of Knight Lancers into this, because looking at the Titan classes of this mana pool, I'm going to run into, I think, two main problems. One, I'm fairly low activations, only with 4 activations. And I think, depending on the mission I draw, I might run into a mobility problem. These guys can definitely take a hit, they can definitely throw out shots at the opponent, but activation mobility would have been a problem, or I think would be a problem, and the Lancers just would have helped me in both of those issues. So I decided to double down and throw 110 points on upgrades across the board, just to maximize what little activations I have and keep these Titans even more durable and get the most out of them. I threw the sensor arrays on the Warlord Titans just because they're going to be slower than the Reavers, and terrain might be more of a factor for them, as it's going to take them more turns to close in on the enemy. So the sensor array will keep their shots more accurate. Bastion shielding is always a favorite of mine. For 10 points to go voids to full without pushing your reactor, it's a no-brainer. I usually, if I've got points to spare, I'll throw these in everywhere I can. Keep in mind too, both of these squadrons, so to speak, are going to be advancing up the board in base-to-base sharing shields. So my warlords are going to be able to merge shields, voids to full twice without pushing that reactor, and the Reaver squadron will be able to do it once. I went with tracking gyroscopes on the warlords alone, just because the closer they get with my opponent, the harder it's going to be to keep my opponent in those front corridors. So allowing those carapace weapons to go from front corridor to front arc is just going to keep those laser blasters up top more effective longer. And there was no need to put tracking gyros on the Reavers, as their carapace weapons are 360 arc, so would have been a waste of points. After the upgrades are in, this list caps out at 1750, right on the money, and this is pretty much as far as I can push this without really kind of screwing up the plan for weapon loadouts. That's the list. There's just 2 more aspects to look at before playing this out. The first one is the Princeps Senioris trait. Shouldn't come as a surprise, but I've gone with Death Before Dishonor. I know my Warlord Princeps Titan is going to take some abuse, as I'm planning on being aggressive. So once that Warlord gets up the field and takes that critical hit, getting full rerolls on that macro and the Sun Fury is just going to be deadly, especially once you close into that 12-inch range activating We Loyal Few. And like I said earlier, once I take that critical damage, I have 0 will to repair that. I want to keep that critical damage there as long as I can. Another thing to look at is stratagems. I go through this exercise every time I build a list, and I try and cherry pick strats that work well for the list. A lot of times I don't find anything overly meaningful, they're just bonuses, but I pointed out a few decent ones that I think would work pretty well with Ignatum, and in particular with this list. The first one, Punish Their Folly, basically Overwatch if your opponent charges you. The Apocalypse Missile Stronghold, basically giving me a missile launcher for strat points. Voidbreaker, kind of in the same vein as the missile launcher, will make my opponent do d6 void saves. Overcharge Cannon could be really good on those Sun Furies, moving them from strength 2 or +2 to +4 on maximal firing, especially once those warlords get in close. Crusade Titans, this will give you +6 on your charge, so you're getting +2 attacks on those close combat weapons if you charge the opponent. Martian Servitor Clades, this one's expensive, but it really makes your list durable. You get +2 repair dice to all Titans. False Intel, I had mentioned I think mobility might be a problem with this list, so if my opponent has something like Retrieval, the ability to move their objective d6 inches closer to me, could be handy and help mitigate that. Tactical Assessment, this allows you to redraw your missions, so I think the list would have two problems. One is activations, the other's mobility. Being able to redraw a mission that suits this list is just going to help you accomplish what you need to. And Augmented Servitor Clades. This gives you +1 repair dice to one of your Titans for 2 stratagem points. Might be worth looking at. Rolling off the assumption that you've got 5 stratagem points, which is kind of the norm for matched play, you might have a little more depending on what your opponent's done. I've narrowed this down and decided to go with Punish Their Folly. With how aggressive I'm being, my opponent is definitely going to charge something into me. Hopefully it's a Titan. If it's Knights, this isn't going to be a factor. The Missile Strong Point is really just going to help me bring down my opponent's shields as I move in. This will hopefully cause me to push those turbo lasers less for Shield Bane. And it was really what to spend the last 2 stratagem points on was a tough call between Overcharge Cannon and Tactical Assessment. Ultimately, I decided to go with Tactical Assessment just because I've got those 2 issues I don't want to be fighting all game, that being activations and mobility, and Tactical Assessment will let me pick an objective I know I can accomplish and just really help the list shine. So let's put all of this together on the tabletop and wrap this one up. Unlike some of the lists we've come up with on this channel, this one actually plays pretty straightforward. In deployment, and pretty much the whole game, the Reavers are always going to be in base-to-base contact, and the Warlords will always be in base-to-base contact. We're going to deploy that Apocalypse Missile Strongpoint somewhere with a good field of view of the whole field. And if I draw bad missions, like say I draw Vital Cargo and Retrieval, we know activations and mobility might be a problem here. It's at this point, pre-turn 1, that I would play Tactical Assessment, allowing me to draw a new mission that is more catered to this list. Turn 1 and turn 2 are pretty much going to be the exact same thing. You're going to be advancing up the board aggressively, staying in base to base with the 2 quasi squadrons. They'll be sharing their shields, maybe firing off that bastion shielding, and of course taking pot shots at the opponent everywhere you can on the way in. Turn 2, same deal, staying base to base, advancing further into that midfield, maybe onto your opponent's side of the board, merging shields, bastion shielding where you have to, if you have it left, and pot shotting. Turn 3 and on, this is where the list really starts to dig its teeth in. You're still going to be in base-to-base contact, still using that launcher wherever you can. Maybe it's even going into Knights, but messing with your opponent's shields if they have them. Still merging shields if you still have your shields. And it's at this point in turn 3 that Ignatum trait, We Loyal Few, is really going to start ripping your opponent apart. You should have most of your opponent's Titans within that 12-inch range of your Titans in turn 3. So every gun in this list should be getting reroll 1s on their hit rolls, just upping the effectiveness of those Gatling Blasters and Sun Furies. These are great weapons for this because they're high shots and a decent, respectable strength, especially if you maximal fire the Sun Furies. So they really lend themselves well to the We Loyal Few rule. Turn 3 on, you still continue taking your pod shots, merging shields if you've got them. We Loyal Few is definitely a factor. But at this point in the game, I would assume the Princeps Senioris has probably taken critical damage, or at least I would hope. So The rest of the maniple is going to be re-rolling 1s, but with that critical damage, your Princeps trait, Death Before Dishonor, is really going to come into play. Your Signorus will now be re-rolling all hits in the combat phase, making him a total deadly Titan, especially being up in your opponent's face. We'll also probably be getting charged somewhere from turn 3, 4, and 5. At some point in the game, I'm sure the opponent's going to charge something. Then we'll activate the Punish Their Folly and give one of the Titans in this maniple Titanicus Overwatch, shooting at that target as it comes in. If I've somehow bitten off more than I can chew against my opponent's list, I'll just hunker down in the midfield, staying in base to base, and not move my Titans. This is going to give them that armored phalanx benefit where they ignore modifiers to damage they've sustained, and being attacked outside of their front arc. So it'll help you weather some abuse from an opponent if you just went in guns blazing and found you're a little outclassed. It'll really help you weather the storm. From then on, the rest of the game, it's just as simple as leveraging We Loyal Few and getting those rerolls and pumping shots out as much as you can. That's the list. Pretty straightforward, just push up the board, get in your opponent's face, and try and max those Legio rules. That was a look at Legio Ignatum. I'm not a fan of the color scheme, but man, do they have some good rules. These guys are a juggernaut on the tabletop, no matter how you play them. What do you think of the list? Does it have as much teeth and bite as I think it does? Especially you experienced Ignatum players. Did I miss something? How are you using them? And just your general thoughts on if your list came up against this. Do you think you'd have a hard time? It's kind of theory hammer list building here on these Legio focuses. If you're liking the game Titanicus and you're not familiar with what we're doing on Voids to Full, then check out the channel. There's tons of content there. And if you're not subscribed already, hit that subscribe button so you can stay up to date on our next Titanicus Legio focus. That's it for this one. Take it easy, and I'll see you guys for whichever Legion we take a look at next.